Thank you, Shishir. It's always difficult to comment on the budget on the same day as the budget because it's impossible to look at the actual budget documents beyond the budget at a glance and maybe some expenditure summaries, etc. So these comments are obviously somewhat preliminary, but nonetheless, here goes. So let me first give the overall macro view. I think I would characterize it as a very conservative budget, which from the sort of fiscal sustainability point of view is very welcome. There are really no flashes in the budget. It's kind of what I might call workman-like or workwoman-like, whichever is the correct term. And it's very clear that the finance minister, if I may just repeat, the finance minister has kept the fiscal sustainability very much in mind. Now, why do I say this? Let's start with the expenditure record. So if you look at, say, the expenditure, the central government expenditure, total expenditure levels as a proportion of GDP between 2014-15 to 2019-20, it is in the range of 12.2 to 13.3% of GDP. Because of COVID, 2020-21, of course, with the fall in the GDP, plus, of course, slowdown, and because of the fall in GDP, tax receipts were much lower. So the expenditure had to increase as a proportion of GDP. So it went up to 17.8%. It has now been 2021-22. It has been contained at 16.3%. So it's come down from 17.8 to 16.3, but this is still much higher than the previous six years or so record. Incidentally, in 2011-12, we go a little further back, it was just under 15%. So the 16.3% for 21-22 is still very high. If you then look at let me just yeah, sorry, I'd missed that it was 2020, 21, 22 was 16.3. It is projected to come down to 15.2 in 22-23, which is, again, it's in the it's just a bit higher than it was in 2011-12 with 14.9%, and we know what happened in the early teens, and so there's still a long way to go to come back to the historical levels in recent past. Then, if you look at revenue expenditure, 2011-12 to 2018-19, it was in the range of 10 to 13% thereabouts of GDP. The BE 2021-22 was 13.1, but the revised estimate is 13.7% of GDP. And that is being projected at 12.3% for 2022-23. There's still a long way to go, but very clearly the government is making a very significant effort to bring back the expenditures to reasonable levels. Going to the revenue side, the Indian tax GDP ratios have really been very, very stable, or the other different way of putting it would be say stagnant, actually. It's quite incredible that back in 2013-14, the gross tax receipts of the central government were 10.1% of GDP. The budget estimate last given for 21-22 was 9.9. So one of the big surprises that has come this year, particularly given it was a COVID year, that the revenue receipt was very buoyant. So it was gross tax receipts were 10.8% of GDP. Relative to 9.9 as was projected. Now, what is surprising is that no buoyancy is being taken for 22-23, which I don't really understand. That if we achieved 10.8% of GDP in the 21-22, why are we only projecting 10.7% of GDP? In fact, a little lower than last year as a proportion of GDP. So I don't really quite understand this. And what there should be some, I presume they have more, obviously, they have information that suggests that they should be conservative. But one would have thought that they would have learned something on why the revenue receipts were much higher in 21-22 than expected, and then that the buoyancy would then continue with the improved collection methods. Within that, if you go to direct tax, it's been really quite stagnant. So 2013-14 was 5.6% of GDP. The 21-22 expectation was 5%. It came out to 5.4, which is a welcome increase. But again, it's only been projected 5.5% of GDP for 22-23. Indirect tax, there has been an increase over time. So 2013-14 was 4.4%. Projection for 21-22 was 4.9. Again, a welcome increase from 4.9 to 5.4% for the revised estimate 21-22. And this actually, the projection for next year is actually lower than what we achieved. So it's going from 5.4 to 5.2. So this is very surprising that with the buoyancy achieved in this past year relative to expectation, what are the reasons for not expecting the buoyancy to continue when, I mean, as of now, we can hope at least that we'll have a normal sort of COVID-free year, 22-23. Of course, one doesn't know what will happen. Now, with all of that, what about fiscal deficit? So it was a long haul after the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008-9, when a great deal of fiscal stimulus was given and then continued, that 2011-12, for example, the fiscal deficit got to 5.9%. And it's been a long haul from that time to bring it back to 3.4% in 2018-19. Then, because of COVID, it went up to 4.6 in 2019-20, 9.2% 2021. It's been contained at 6.8, 6.9% in 21-22, and it's being now projected at 6.4% for 22-23. But I think that, as I said, this is, I think, the best that the finance minister could have done. But looking at the record of the last decade, it tells us that we have a long road back to fiscal sustainability, given how long it took to come down from around 6% of GDP fiscal deficit in the early teens to 3.4 2018-19. So it'll take a long time. And there's really not much compression you can do over the expenditure. And therefore, it really depends on what kind of revenue buoyancy we can achieve. And I think we have to be much more ambitious than is being shown in the budget. But as I said, I don't know the reasons why they have done that. And keep in mind that because of these high fiscal deficits, interest payments are now 20% of total expenditure. So that needs to be kept in mind. That's as far as the macro sort of tax view is concerned. The government, of course, in terms of growth, is projecting 8.5%, which is a bit of a surprise, since the IMF projected 9.0, and if I remember correctly, the RBI projected 9.2. So once again, I think that is good in the sense that the government is the finance minister is being conservative in terms of projection of growth for next year. Going on the numbers, the budget last year, that is for 21, I mean for the current year, that is 21-22, had projected 1.75 trillion rupees, 1.75 lakh crores for disinvestment. The revised estimate is 35,000 crores, and I presume that this is assuming that the LIC IPO will go through and the Neelachal Ispat privatization also go through. Again, consistent with the conservative approach all around, that the estimate for next year, that is 22-23, is actually less than what is expected to be achieved this year at 65,000 crores. So this is very interesting. Again, there wasn't much of an explanation in the speech on why this is being done, given that the government is very clear on its objective for large-scale privatization, including of a couple of banks, So it's a little surprising, particularly given the successful experience of the Air India in terms of process, that I would have thought the government would be more confident. But once again, it seems that the finance minister obviously must have been unhappy with last year's target and heavily underachieving it. So she has given, in some sense, what is possibly a realistic target, and maybe it'll be exceeded. Now, the consequence of all this is that the gross borrowing estimate for 22-23 is 15 trillion rupees, compared to about 12 trillion. I think it's about 14.9, it's around 15 trillion rupees, compared to around 12 trillion rupees for 21-22. And as I understand it, just within the day, the 10-year yield has already gone up. So despite the conservatism that I've talked about, the market is clearly interpreting the increase in borrowing will have an impact on the bond market and hence on interest rates. And this then would pose a challenge for the RBI in terms of its monetary policy if the 10-year yields or even the shorter term yields go much higher than its monetary policy, the policy rates. So much for the numbers. Now, some comments on some key features. It's going through the budget speech and then reviewing it. I would term this budget as the first digital budget, apart from the fact that the whole thing is available digitally. But there's a huge, huge emphasis of the government in almost every sphere on the digital economy. And I will just list out what I made a list of something like 8 or 9 initiatives. I may have missed some actually in making my list. First, on education. The finance minister mentioned that so many children have lost 2 years of schooling, which is true given because of COVID. So there's lots of children who would have entered school at a certain age and they haven't entered. So they're 2 years behind in terms of their lives in schooling. Second, of course, children who are already in school have missed 2 years of schooling and they have to catch up. But what was surprising to me was that the solution to this is found in the digital economy. So it was mentioned that the government is going to increase TV channels in all different languages, or sort of class-wise TV channels, from 12 to 200. It's very welcome. But the question is whether these, and there'll be many other digital tools that will be rolled out. But the question really is that given that what we already know in terms of the difference in that is the difference between the better off and the less well off in their access to digital education that has already taken place, that I'm a bit that whereas this is a welcome move, it's always very good to do these new things, but the question is, there was absolutely no mention of other programs that would be needed on the ground to make up for the lost 2 years for the less well off who don't have all these gadgets to actually do the online education. And there's also mention of starting a digital university. Again, a welcome move to do a digital university. But once again, I would say that we know from all the information that we have that the hundreds or thousands of colleges, universities that we have in the higher education sector have major quality deficits. And again, it seems that the assumption seems to be that providing quality digital or online higher education will solve that problem. There's nothing in some sense on improving, no allocation as far as I can see, on improving the quality of existing universities. Second, post office. Again, this is a very welcome move to announce that within this fiscal year, within the next 22-23 fiscal year, that all post offices will be connected to online banking. From my earlier work in financial inclusion, I've always felt that when we talk to financial inclusion, people forgot that the less well-off, particularly in rural areas, depended a lot on post offices for their savings accounts, etc. And now they'll all be online. They can make transfers online in post offices, both to all commercial banks. And this will be very, very good for so many of the migrant labor who do transactions, who earn in towns and cities and send back money to their families back home in rural areas. I think this was really a marvelous announcement that all post offices will be covered in the coming fiscal year. Third, the digitization of manual governance. I'm not quite sure what this means, but basically lots of government permissions, presumably, approvals could be done digitally, and that would then reduce face-to-face contact. Again, once again, it is welcome because reducing face-to-face contact reduces corruption, etc. But on the other hand, again, one wonders on how this helps, how this helps the less well-off who need those kind of approvals. Fourth, there will be digital information on all approvals, and this will help small and medium enterprises, so that when you apply for some approval, you would then know where exactly your approval is. This is sort of like the tracking thing that we have in Amazon and so on, where you know exactly where the parcel is that you've ordered, and that you know exactly when it's going to come. So I think, again, this would be very good for ease of doing business. The fifth initiative in the digital economy, the issuance of E-Passports. Again, I don't know as a traveler how that would actually work. How do you get visas and E-Passports, since we require visas for most countries? But nonetheless, whatever can be done to ease getting of passports is welcome. One of the most, I think, welcome moves, which has been going on for some time, is a nationwide system for IT-based land records. We have been associated with some of the work that is going on in this, and we ourselves have sponsored some work on this. So there are lots of issues there, but given that the Indian judicial system is swamped with land disputes, that one would hope that if indeed we succeed in doing IT-based land records countrywide, then over a period of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever, that this could reduce, hopefully, the disputes that arise on land ownership. But this is, again, work in progress. Seventh, e-based, online-based government procurement. Again, that would make life much easier for many suppliers, especially SMEs. Seventh, I have some doubt on this one. The announcement of digital rupee and the announcement of a central bank digital currency. The huge implications of this, I hope that is being thought about carefully, because from my understanding, central bank digital currency, what does it mean? It essentially means that what is currency? It is the paper currency is a liability of the central bank, and so that is why you have sort of zero risk. Once you have cash in your pocket, you have zero risk in doing a payment to someone. The receiver of that has zero risk, and that the payment is totally assured. That rupee is totally assured by the central bank. Now, when you talk about the CBDC, central bank digital currency, what it essentially means, as far as I understand it, is that everyone will then have a retail account in the Reserve Bank of India. It has many implications, and I will just name a couple of them. One is that what then happens to deposits in banks? Will these accounts in the central bank be interest bearing, which will then have a cost to the central bank, that is the Reserve Bank of India? And if it does, then will so many deposits move from commercial banks? Then how will commercial banks have their liabilities to be able to get their resources to do lending? It's a huge issue which is being discussed globally on how a CBDC, central bank digital currency, can be managed. So, and of course, the implication of this is that if you have a CBDC and everyone has an account in the central bank, what we today know as M2 becomes M0. In other words, it will be the balance sheet of central bank would expand tremendously. And the question is, what then will be their assets? Where will they have to then dilute the quality of their assets? Because clearly, the central bank can't just have all the government securities out in the market and then have to go to other private securities, etc. So I think there are lots of issues here, and it's not clear to me at all what is the incentive to do CBDC, particularly because India has been a real pioneer in making digital transactions very easy for the common person, common man, and everyone who has a cell phone can do easy transfers through Paytm, etc. So in some sense, to my mind, we've already done all the excellent work in having a equivalent of digital currency, that is, that people can do e-transfers very easily from bank to bank and through the intermediaries like Paytm, etc. So I don't quite understand the desire to do a CBDC. Along with that, the finance minister has announced 30% tax on capital gains from what she calls digital assets, which essentially means crypto assets. This, to my mind, is a very welcome move because there's been a proliferation of these crypto assets, and the time will definitely come when lots of common people will lose their shirts on these crypto assets. And so hopefully this will curb the incentive for people to invest in crypto assets. Now, there is a downside to it, which I understand is an issue, which is that if you do this, people will just move crypto assets abroad. So the question is, what that I think is a welcome move as far as the digital asset taxation is concerned, but I am somewhat skeptical of how we're going to manage the CBDC and what's the incentive to do that. Let me just conclude this part on the digital economy by saying that these are all welcome moves, but one does have to ask the question on how accessible many of these facilities will be to the less well-off, particularly rural areas with poor connectivity, who have basic devices. They've lost 2 years of schooling. Also, there was a mention of health services being digitized, etc. So I think I have lots of questions on those, but nonetheless, all these moves are very welcome. Let me come to the next feature that I would talk about in the budget, that is infrastructure. Again, a welcome emphasis. The infrastructure capital expenditures to be increased 35%. There isn't that kind of increase, by the way, in the capex expenditures in the budget documents. But we'll need to look at this in much more detail because there's obviously a huge mixture between public investment and PPP, etc. Looking very quickly at the budget documents, there's a very clear increase in the allocations for roads, railways, and metro transport, that is. It's difficult to get in this short period of time to get other information, but this is a very welcome move to emphasize allocation to infrastructure. One thing I would mention is that it's not clear from the budget speech where the national infrastructure pipeline fits into these numbers. One thing that was a bit surprising was that last year, or the current year, 21-22, if you remember correctly, there was an allocation of 55,000 crores to the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, which I understood was for the national infrastructure pipeline. I think less than 10% of that actually has been spent. And now that line is completely missing in next year's budget. So I'm a bit curious on where does national infrastructure pipeline now show up, in which heads of budget. Maybe it's in all the different ministries, etc. But in my quick look, I couldn't find it. And it's certainly not labeled as the national infrastructure pipeline. I won't say more on infrastructure, except to just, as I said, to repeat that these are welcome moves on emphasizing infrastructure. Third, there's a very welcome emphasis on urban development, with a mention that by 2050, at least the majority of Indians will be living in urban areas. I may mention here that I first came back to India in 1981. That was my area of concentration. That's the only thing that I was interested in. Unfortunately, it has taken 40 years for other people to realize that this is of the utmost importance. But because of my own interest, I welcome this emphasis. Once again, however, there's always a however, whereas the finance minister said that there's a need to facilitate urbanization in tier 2, 3 cities, etc., but I don't see the allocation of funds in the Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Basically, I think 7 to 80% of the allocation basically goes to metros, that is metro transport. So whereas I really welcome this mention of urban development in the budget speech, but I don't see the allocations. The other thing that I also welcome is that the mention that capacity building will be strengthened by designating 5 urban planning institutions as centers of excellence. So this is absolutely music to my ears. Fourth, I'll just now come to the end in terms of what is, so to repeat, huge emphasis on the digital economy, emphasis on infrastructure, emphasis on urban development. On the macro side, conservative, welcome conservative move in terms of the numbers. What have been missing? Even though there was a good deal of mention on various actions on climate change, consistent with the Prime Minister's commitments in COP26, in my quick look, I'm not able to find those corresponding allocations. The biggest, to my mind, the biggest feature that is missing in the budget speech and in the budget, as far as I could see, are allocations of health and education. I would have thought that one thing that we have learned in the last 2 years is that we really have to ramp up health and education programs. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of how do we actually manage this? Apart from the last 2 years, there's been a general issue that over 75 years since our independence, we have neglected these 2 areas. And I don't see any correction in that in this budget, either in terms of mention or in terms of actual allocation. And finally, not finally, there's very little mention of the high unemployment that has resulted from the COVID 2 years and what we're going to do about it in particular. There is an increase in the allocation for the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, but that's all that I can see. There isn't sort of a programmatic approach to how we increase employment. And this, of course, is a huge, it's a huge issue. And finally, there was mention of exports, essentially connected to the PLI scheme, but I don't see any program and there was mention of revamping SEZ with the new law, etc. But I don't see a particular emphasis, this connected to unemployment, employment, etc., on a push for labor-intensive exports, which all successful countries have done in terms of increasing the employment, increasing the growth rate, etc. I've already taken about 5 times the amount of time I should have taken, but I'll stop there.